Hello and welcome to this module entitled How to Leverage Procurement to Realise Cost Savings. My name is Doug Fraser. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And this module is brought to you by the International Institute for Procurement and Market Research. Our learning objectives for this module are to consider the impact procurement can have on cost savings and in turn on profitability. We will then move on to consider some of the techniques and tools through which cost savings can be achieved, primarily focusing on supplier consolidation, spend consolidation, sourcing, particularly through low-cost countries, sustainable procurement, and the role of contract renegotiation. I want to commence this module by looking at the impact of cost savings and profitability. Before we focus on the details on this slide, at a high level, I think it is worth mentioning that cost savings are of differing importance depending on the industry in question. In industries where profit margins tend to be low, such as the food retail business and airlines, the role of cost savings and profitability are particularly important on an ongoing basis. In other industries, it is more cyclical. When profits drop, then the role of cost savings becomes that more important. This can be seen at present in the oil and gas industry, where because of the price of gas and oil drastically reducing, in order to protect their profit margins, such companies are taking steps to achieve cost reductions. Now, as this slide says, the value of purchased goods and services, i.e. what is procured, is usually a high percentage of an organisation's revenue. Although, as we have already said, this does vary sector to sector. In this typical example, we can see here that the cost of goods and services for the organisation in question is 50% of the total revenues of the organisation, while labour and overheads come to 45%, and the profit is a 5% total. Now we can quite quickly see from this slide the importance of cost reductions in enhancing profitability. If we can achieve a 5% reduction in the cost of the goods and services procured for this organisation, the profit margin will increase by 50%. Now that is very impressive. If we were not to seek an increase in profit through a reduction in the procurement cost, it would be much harder to achieve it through other methods. As this slide says, for this company, this would mean increasing sales by 50%, which is unlikely to be realistic, or reducing overheads by up to 20%. Again, this is going to be very challenging, or reducing employee numbers. So the role of cost reductions in increasing profit margins is known as the leverage effect. And as this slide says, in this example, every pound, or it could be dollars, saved in purchased materials increases pre-tax profits by an equivalent pound or dollar, as the case may be. So I think we have set the case for the importance of cost savings. And now I'd like to move on to some consideration of how such cost savings can be achieved. One key way to realise cost savings is through supplier consolidation. Supplier consolidation means reducing the number of suppliers that you procure goods and services from. Now, there is a natural balance to be achieved in terms of reducing the number of suppliers with managing the risks in the supply chain. If we reduce the suppliers too much, then we are over-dependent on a limited number of suppliers, and should anything happen to those particular suppliers or the products they offer, then the buyer will be exposed. But we haven't answered the fundamental question: how does supplier consolidation actually realise cost savings? Reducing the number of suppliers in its own right does not automatically mean we're going to achieve cost savings. Where we will realise such savings is where, because there are now less suppliers, the cost for procurement and finance and other admin costs to service those suppliers from the buyer will be less. So naturally, if I'm only dealing with 5 or 10 suppliers rather than perhaps 100 in the past, my costs in dealing with these suppliers will be far less, and it should be possible to greatly automise that process. This means, certainly for procurement staff, that they can focus on more strategic tasks, such as sourcing or building long-term relationships with strategic suppliers. And one of the critical ways in which supplier consolidation achieves reduced costs is through the economies of scale, whereby higher volumes are ordered from the more limited number of providers. The economies of scale that these providers are exposed to mean they can offer lower prices to the procuring entity. In turn, because we're dealing with less providers, we should be able to make a greater investment in those relationships. And this, in turn, should see financial rewards. Fragmentation of spend is where, within an organisation, a number of entities, aside from procurement, are undertaking procurement activities. Fragmentation is more common where there are a wide number of suppliers who an entity are procuring from. When there are a fewer number of suppliers, it's easier to keep track of who is receiving the contracts and to cut down on the fragmentation. Fragmentation, in turn, increases costs and admin spend within the procuring entity. And it is quite common in the press to read about large organisations going through supplier consolidation programs to achieve exactly the benefits that we've laid out on this slide. We have some examples on this slide of some specific entities that have gone through supplier consolidation exercises and achieved considerable benefits and cost savings as a result. Chrysler, the American automotive manufacturer, over 5 years reduced their suppliers from 2,500 to 1,114. And more importantly, within 5 years, 90% of their spend was focused on only 150 suppliers. This meant that in terms of producing a vehicle, they achieved time savings of 32%, so a third, and their profit per vehicle increased by 118%. Now, Intel, a computer chip manufacturer, they took an interesting approach to supplier consolidation. You will remember on the previous slide we talked about balancing supplier consolidation with supply chain risk. They took an approach where they would consolidate suppliers on an N+1 basis, where N is the minimum number of suppliers, so that they would not be overexposed. They would always have one more than the minimum number of suppliers in a stated category. So they would achieve cost savings, but at the same time they would try to limit the supply chain risk. Motorola, who produced mobile phones, also went through a similar supplier consolidation exercise. They reduced their supply base from 4,200 to 1,155 over 5 years. As you will notice in this slide, supplier consolidation does take a period of time, not least because contracts are generally in effect even after the supplier consolidation decision has been made. Returning to Motorola, capacitators are a key part of their product, and they reduced the number of suppliers in this particular area from 25 to just 3. And their savings were multi-million-dollar savings on an annual basis. So we've talked about supplier consolidation, but we also alluded to the importance of spend consolidation. As I've already mentioned, typically in organisations, the amount of spend under the control of procurement is more fragmented than might be anticipated. Perhaps, according to a KPMG study in 2012, this was a global study across direct and indirect spend, they found that only 60% of spend in an organisation was typically under the control of procurement. The more spend that can be consolidated under the control of procurement should mean greater economies of scale being realised and cost savings as a result. Even where spend is officially under company policy supposed to be consolidated under procurement, there is often a problem of maverick buying. Maverick buying is where certain entities or units within an organisation go against the official policy whereby procurement spend is supposed to be consolidated, and they carry out their own unauthorised procurement. And again, this cuts down the possibility of really realising cost reductions. So supplier consolidation, as we've already said, is very closely linked to spend consolidation, as it is easier to monitor the spend and where it has been undertaken where there are less providers. To prevent fragmented spend and maverick buying, it's very important to have good data. And there are a number of software packages out there which can track where an organisation's spend is coming from and who is responsible for that. Now, not all spend can be consolidated on a day-by-day basis under procurement, but that does not mean procurement cannot play an important role in managing that spend and ensuring that it is, to the extent possible, consolidated and cost savings are achieved. This is particularly in the area of indirect procurement, where there tend to be a considerable number of different types of categories. And some tools that procurement can bring to realise spend consolidation for this type of spend are frameworks and guides on how spend should be undertaken. Again, even where it is fragmented, to the extent possible seeking consolidation. So if one entity is buying, for example, stationery products, then the procurement department may dictate that spend should be with certain providers using predetermined rates. And this can be taken a little stage further through using tools such as e-catalogues to guide behaviour. So the units or departments in question can undertake their own procurement, and they probably have a variety of choice, but the products available to them and the prices of those products are dictated by an e-catalogue. So typically the unit department can go online or onto their intranet, automatically select what they choose to procure, and then a purchase order will be placed with the supplier in question. And procurement will have the confidence of knowing that the prices will be within the range that they have already negotiated. Any spend consolidation exercise also needs clear cost-saving targets to direct behaviour. And on this slide, we have an example of an e-catalogue that can be used for indirect procurement. This e-catalogue shows IT equipment that can be purchased by units or departments themselves. And you can see here, for example, PCs, notebooks, servers, screens, etc. that they can purchase through this e-procurement platform. This one is provided by a platform known as PISMA. So for the notebook or laptop in question on this slide, you can see there is a preset model available and a price. We have an example here of a leading US telecommunications firm that undertook a spend consolidation exercise. After undertaking analysis, and we've said already on the previous slide, the analysis is a very important step in the process to understand the spend, they found 5% of their spend, which represented over 1.5 billion US, was fragmented. And there was also much maverick buying. Therefore, they acquired new spend analysis software to make the analysis process that much easier. They purchased this software from Infosys, a leading Indian software provider in this particular area. And they set quite ambitious spend consolidation targets. They sought to consolidate 900 million of the 1.5 billion fragmented spend. And within the first year, they realized cost savings of 60 million US. And importantly, they significantly reduced maverick spend. Maverick spend does tend to dissipate where there is high-level senior management support for consolidating the spend, and also where the wins are clearly documented from the spend consolidation program. Let us now look at sourcing as a tool to reduce costs, and in particular sourcing from low-cost countries. You may hear these referred to as LCCs. The Aberdeen Group, a consultancy outfit, found that for direct materials, sourcing from low-cost countries can achieve a 40% cost saving. Now, there are minimum and maximum savings, and these are different depending on the categories in question. And you can see in chart 1 on this particular slide, estimated minimum and maximum savings for different items. Plastics, tooling, cable and harness, electronics and assembly equipment, and mechanics. It's also important to remember, beyond actual materials, what is known as BPO, or business process outsourcing from low-cost countries, can also achieve considerable savings. Now, what does business process outsourcing actually involve? This generally involves outsourcing the back office function of an entity, such as admin or finance activities, sometimes customer call centers. And key BPO centers globally today are found in countries such as India and the Philippines. But what are the drivers for the cost savings from moving to low-cost country locations for direct materials or for BPO activities? Generally, the labour costs do tend to be considerably lower. Also, infrastructure costs are often lower, although it should be noted infrastructure is not necessarily as advanced. And because a number of entities are moving to such LCC locations and seeking similar services or subcomponents, this tends to generate competition and further reduce the prices. Some LCC governments have also offered incentives for production of some of the materials required. and they've developed special economic zones, for example, or tax incentives. The cost savings have to be looked at in a holistic sense. Just because labour costs are cheaper, it doesn't necessarily mean that the end product as a whole will be cheaper, because it still has to be shipped to its final market, and other costs such as customs or inspections have to be paid for. But generally, even with such costs, there are substantial savings to be realised. The greatest savings tend to be in the short term, where high labour cost and low product complexity to come together. There is an added benefit that in many of the LCC locations, there is also a growing need, or growing demand, I should say, for domestic consumption with a growing middle class. So entities who source and produce in such locations potentially have access also to a new market, and China is a prime example. However, there are challenges for entities operating in LCC locations. Entities find themselves dealing with a different culture, language, and operating environment. The legal and regulatory framework may not be as developed as that in developed countries, and this can prove challenging. In one particular area, there is a considerable concern, and that is intellectual property right. This is both in terms of legal and illegal loss of intellectual property right. Legal loss of intellectual property right may come about where the LCC government permits foreign entities to produce in their countries, but only if a certain amount of technology transfer takes place. And this is very common in China. But also, there is a fear of illegal intellectual property right loss, whereby entities sourcing and producing in the country may find that their particular patents and copyrights are illegally copied by local competition. This is particularly a problem for those sourcing products from LCC locations, where they will need to make investment in local suppliers to bring them up to the necessary production grade that they require. And in doing so, they will be sharing intellectual property right with those suppliers. Another danger, which again we have alluded to earlier in this particular module, is that operating in LCC environments generally means there is a longer and more exposed supply chain. And a good example would be the Thai floods of 2011 exposed many automotive and IT manufacturers to this particular threat. As a result of the floods, key components and subcomponents could not meet assembly plants in other countries, and as a result, the whole supply chain suffered. There is also challenges with a weaker ethical and environmental standards in such environments. And where suppliers and even sub-suppliers have weak ethical and environmental standards, this can cause reputational damage for the procuring entity. And this has been a recurring theme in the sports shoe industry over the last 20 years, as they have procured raw materials and moved production to LCCs. More recently, we have seen the example with the Bangladesh factory that produced garments, particularly for Primark in the UK. The factory collapsed with the devastating loss of 1,129 deaths. And aside having a tragic effect on the local community, This also caused serious reputational damage for Primark. Let's look at some examples of some entities who have successfully used sourcing and sourcing from LCCs to reduce their costs. One is IKEA, low-cost, flat-pack furniture manufacturer. IKEA was forced to seek LCC options because they were shut out of the Swedish market by manufacturers there, who were concerned that they would be required to reduce their costs and profit margin if they sourced products to IKEA. Therefore, IKEA looked at new options in LCC countries. First of all, they turned to Poland, which at that stage was still outside of the EU. Then they went from Poland to Eastern Europe, and more recently they've turned to China. IKEA has sourced raw materials such as cotton, wood and metal, which are essential to their furniture. But they have also recognised the importance of sourcing research and development capacity from LCC countries, where there is often a large number of highly qualified but still low-cost resource in the market. And they have taken advantage of this to set up R&D facilities in Taiwan and China in recent years. Their recent move to China has realised savings of approximately 20%, and they have since sought to increase those savings by building long-term relationships. IKEA interestingly believes their competitors have not realised the same cost savings because they've failed to form long-term relationships with suppliers in Asia. Powerwave Technologies, an American telecommunications company, is another entity that has sought to source from LCCs on a substantive scale. They started sourcing from Estonia in Eastern Europe and moved to Asia, sourcing from China, Malaysia and Thailand. Currently, an average 70% of their spend is with LCCs, and they plan to increase this to a substantive 90% and are seeing real cost savings and innovation benefits as a result. Another area of cost saving is through sustainable procurement. In some circles, sustainable procurement is seen as procurement which actually increases the cost of products and services. But that does not need to be the case. Sustainable procurement actually is good procurement, robust procurement, and holistic procurement. It considers the total life cost of products. It looks at the investment cost, the upfront cost of buying a product, the cost of operations, of actually using that product, the cost of maintaining that product, servicing it, the spare parts in question, and the cost that is often forgotten of disposing of a product. This can be very high, particularly when products have certain chemicals or toxicity in their makeup. Now, this chart on the slide shows an interesting picture. What are perhaps deemed as green products may cost more initially to purchase, but their whole life cost may be less. We see here on this particular chart that for a standard product the upfront price may be less, but the operation price, the cost of operating that particular product, the waste it produces during its lifetime and at disposal stage may be considerably higher. And examples here include vehicles, lighting and IT equipment. So for example, an electric vehicle costs more to purchase, but the operations cost, particularly if it can be coupled with solar panels for charging, are considerably less, and certainly the wastage and the pollution are considerably less. and disposable costs are also a lot less. So where can we make gains in terms of sustainable procurement quickly? Research has shown that there are what is known as low-hanging fruits or quick win areas for many companies in the areas of energy reduction. Often renewable energy solutions or energy efficiency solutions can be implemented relatively quickly and have quick payback periods. Operations and also logistics, which is often vital to many companies. As this slide says, regulations increasingly require higher environmental and socially sound standards. Now, if an entity is able to be an early adopter and to take the time to realize savings in a sustainable manner, rather than being forced to rush through changes later, the gains are likely to be that much greater, and the cost savings will be achieved over a longer period of time, meaning that the profitability of these entities potentially can be that much greater than their competitors. Also, the other interesting point to make is increasingly consumers and customers in their own right are demanding more sustainable procurement practices, and they want the products they buy to be more efficient and to produce less waste, and often to be able to recycle such products. So I would argue the current climate is right for companies to consider sustainable procurement and to realize the benefits from it. We have some examples here of companies that have already been very aggressive in the sustainable procurement space and realizing considerable savings as a result. You can see on this slide Unilever, who make toiletry products, Hilton, the hotel chain, and Herman Miller, who make primarily office furnishings, have ambitious targets to reduce their energy, emissions, waste, and water, and as a result to receive considerable cost savings. Unilever has actually won many awards already for its sustainable procurement practices. We have some other examples on this slide. Walmart, the supermarket chain that is based in the US but operates globally, has reduced packaging on its products by 5% and has thus far realized a saving of a massive $3 billion. Staples, an office supply company, again US based, has switched to electric delivery trucks and expects to save $60,000 per truck over the lifetime of the usage of that truck. So the savings are significant aside from the reduction in carbon emissions. There are a few points that I want to highlight in terms of sustainable procurement. To realize the savings that this tool offers, it's important to take a total life cycle approach and to consider the costs over each particular phase. A net present value approach can be taken to costing to give an accurate picture. When designing requirements, specifications, and designs and standards required within these can be prepared to promote efficiency and the recyclability of products. Providers will only respond or only likely to respond if the specifications and designs actually push them to look at efficiencies and cost savings. It's also important to review the wider supply chain. The first tier supplier will be hampered in what cost savings they can realise in terms of sustainable procurement if the second or third tier suppliers are not yet adopting the relevant approaches. And equally, entities need to think about their second and third tier customers in some cases to drive behaviours and to build such innovation into their cultures. A final area I'd like to look at in terms of cost savings is renegotiating contracts. This is an often overlooked area. There's a quote here from Carlos Gosch from Nissan when he joined Nissan and they were in a very difficult financial situation. He said, "If I'm not making money, you're not making money, and in order to succeed collectively, we'll have to work together on adjusting prices." So how can we go about renegotiating contracts? It's important to build renegotiations into even long-term contracts and to benchmark costs from such contracts against industry standards and competitors before commencing such renegotiations. Also, savings are easier to realise in the renegotiation process if it is undertaken in the context of supplier consolidation. As we've said already, if we're reducing the number of suppliers and increasing the demand from these more limited pool of suppliers, economies of scale should be realised and cost savings passed on. Should also be encouraging innovation to reduce costs. So it's not just a case of preparing specifications and designs with requirements for cost savings and greater efficiencies, but also asking our suppliers to proactively look at cost reduction possibilities. And if contracts build in the possibilities of sharing the gains made and capturing this over the lifetime of the contract, greater innovation is much more likely to be realised. This means that the renegotiation process, where this is built into contracts, can result in a win-win situation for suppliers and procuring entities. Also, cost reductions may be possible where the procuring entity is able to bring greater value to their supplier. The example given here is perhaps providing gateways to new markets. An example I'd like to share with you is a beverage company was seeking a price reduction from their beverage packaging supplier. Now their supplier was seemingly renegotiating their contract from a position of strength. They had a patent for the beverage packaging required, and they already offered the lowest price. So it seemed a very difficult task for the procuring entity to seek any further cost reduction. However, the procuring entity realised that they were entering two key new markets for the first time. These were also markets that the beverage packaging company didn't have any presence in, but was very keen to access. Therefore, they were able to negotiate a 10% global cost reduction on the understanding that the procuring entity would use their packaging solely in these two new markets. I hope this has been a useful and informative module on the value that procurement can offer in terms of cost reductions. And I look forward to you joining future such modules. Thank you very much.